The rain drummed against the windows of Sullivan's pub, a dimly lit establishment, tucked between towering university buildings. Steam rose from wet coats hanging near the entrance, and the murmur of academic conversations filled the air with an almost scholarly reverence. This was no ordinary evening gathering place. Sullivan's had earned its reputation as the unofficial meeting ground for visiting professors, where minds from different eras of thought could collide over pints and heated discussions. In the corner booth, two figures sat across from each other, their appearances as contrasting as their philosophical foundations. Thomas Aquinas, despite his medieval origins, had adapted remarkably well to the 21st century academic circuit. His robust frame filled the wooden chair, and his eyes held that same penetrating intensity that had once dissected Aristotelian logic in the universities of Paris. Across from him, David Hume appeared more at ease with the casual atmosphere, his Scottish pragmatism evident in the way he nursed his whiskey and observed the world with skeptical amusement. The debate had begun innocuously enough. A young art student at the neighboring table had been loudly proclaiming that a particular modern installation was absolutely beautiful, while her companion insisted it was complete garbage. The disagreement had caught the attention of both philosophers, though for entirely different reasons. Aquinas leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of theological and philosophical tradition. "You see, my friend," he began, addressing Hume with the familiarity of intellectual equals, "what that young woman experiences is not merely her opinion about beauty. She recognizes something that exists independently of her personal preferences, an objective quality that makes the object truly beautiful." Hume's eyebrows raised with characteristic skepticism, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, Thomas, always reaching for the absolute, are we not? But tell me, if beauty were truly objective, why do we see such passionate disagreement about what constitutes it? Those two students cannot both be correct about the same object, can they?" The Scottish philosopher took a measured sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Aquinas's face. "I would suggest that what the young lady calls absolutely beautiful is nothing more than the projection of her own sentiments onto the object. Beauty, my dear colleague, resides not in things themselves, but in the mind that contemplates them." Aquinas's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the focused determination of a master craftsman preparing to demonstrate his skill. "Oh, you speak as if human judgment were the final arbiter of truth, David. But consider this, when we call something beautiful, we do not merely report our feelings, we make a claim about the object itself. We assert that it possesses certain qualities that ought to inspire admiration in any properly functioning intellect." The warmth of the pub seemed to intensify around their table, as if the very air recognized the significance of the ideas being exchanged. Other patrons began to quiet their own conversations, drawn by the magnetic pull of philosophical discourse conducted with passion and precision. Hume leaned back, his expression thoughtful but unconvinced. "But you assume, Thomas, that there exists some standard of proper functioning that transcends human experience. From where does this standard derive? And more importantly, how can we access it except through our own limited and fallible perceptions?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, dense with implications. Aquinas's fingers drummed against the worn wooden table, a habit that had persisted across centuries of intellectual combat. He could feel the familiar surge of energy that came with defending what he considered the bedrock of rational inquiry, the belief that truth existed independently of human opinion. "The standard derives from the very structure of reality itself," Aquinas replied, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Beauty is not some arbitrary human invention, but a reflection of the order and harmony that pervades creation. When we recognize beauty, we participate in a truth that transcends our individual limitations." Hume's laugh was gentle but pointed. "Creation? Order? You invoke metaphysical concepts that cannot be verified through experience. How can you be certain that what you call objective beauty is not simply the result of common human nature, shared psychological tendencies that make us respond similarly to certain patterns and proportions?" The two philosophers fell into a momentary silence, each recognizing that they had touched upon fundamental questions that went far beyond aesthetic theory. The nature of objectivity itself was at stake, along with humanity's capacity to know truth independently of personal experience and cultural conditioning. Around them, the pub continued its evening rhythm, but at their table time seemed suspended. Two great minds, separated by centuries and continents, had found themselves locked in a debate that would reveal not just their views on beauty, but their entire philosophical worldviews. The stage was set for an intellectual duel that would challenge both men to defend their deepest convictions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and human experience. The amber light from the pub's vintage fixtures cast shadows across Aquinas' weathered features as he considered Hume's challenge. The medieval scholar's eyes held a mixture of respect and determination. He had encountered skepticism before, but rarely from someone as intellectually formidable as the Scottish empiricist sitting across from him. "You raise the question of shared human nature," Aquinas began, his voice measured and deliberate, "but you fail to see that this very commonality points towards something objective. If beauty were truly subjective, merely a matter of individual taste, why do we find such remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries in what humans consider beautiful?" He gestured toward the stone arches visible through the pub's windows, remnants of Gothic architecture that had endured for hundreds of years. Those arches were not designed by committee or focus group, David. Yet people from vastly different backgrounds continue to find them beautiful. This suggests that beauty is not simply projected by the mind, but discovered by it. Hume's fingers traced the rim of his glass as he pondered this argument. His skeptical nature rebelled against easy generalizations, but he recognized the force of Aquinas' observation. "I grant you that humans share certain tendencies in aesthetic judgment," he conceded, "but this proves nothing about objectivity. Could it not be that our common evolutionary heritage has shaped us to respond similarly to certain stimuli? What you call objective beauty might simply be the result of natural selection favoring those who found pleasure in symmetry, proportion, and harmony." The pub's atmosphere seemed to thicken with intellectual tension. Nearby tables had grown quieter, their occupants unconsciously drawn into the orbit of the debate. A young philosophy professor at the bar had turned completely around, pretending to check his phone while straining to catch every word. Aquinas leaned forward, his conviction evident in every gesture. "But you cannot explain why natural selection would favor aesthetic sensitivity unless beauty corresponds to something real and valuable in the world. Why would creatures evolve to appreciate harmony and proportion unless these qualities possessed genuine significance?" "Perhaps," Hume replied with characteristic caution, "because those who could appreciate pattern and symmetry were better at surviving and reproducing. The ability to recognize beauty in a landscape might correlate with the ability to identify fertile ground or safe shelter. What you interpret as objective beauty might simply be the evolutionary residue of practical judgment." The Scottish philosopher paused, studying his companion's reaction. "But let me pose a different question, Thomas. Even if we grant that humans share certain aesthetic tendencies, how do we account for the dramatic differences in taste between individuals and cultures? The same Gothic arch that inspires you might strike someone from a different tradition as cold and forbidding." Aquinas' response came without hesitation, as if he had anticipated this objection for centuries. "Individual differences in aesthetic judgment do not negate the existence of objective beauty any more than mathematical errors negate the existence of objective mathematical truth. Some people calculate incorrectly, but this does not make arithmetic subjective." The analogy hung between them like a bridge, connecting abstract philosophical territory with concrete experience. Hume recognized its power, even as he prepared to challenge its foundation. "But mathematics deals with relationships between abstract concepts," Hume countered, "while beauty involves our emotional and sensory responses to particular objects. Can you seriously claim that aesthetic judgment operates with the same logical rigor as mathematical proof?" The fire in the hearth crackled and sparked, sending dancing shadows across the walls. The sound seemed to underscore the intensity of their exchange, as if nature itself were commenting on the debate between reason and experience. Aquinas straightened in his chair, his medieval training in logical disputation fully engaged. "You assume that emotional response and logical rigor are incompatible, but this is precisely where your empiricism leads you astray. The proper response to genuine beauty involves both the intellect and the emotions working in harmony. When we recognize true beauty, we do not merely feel pleasure. We understand why the object deserves our admiration." "Understanding," Hume's voice carried a note of gentle mockery, "or rationalization? How can you distinguish between genuine insight into an object's beautiful qualities and the human tendency to invent reasons for our preferences after the fact?" The question struck at the heart of their philosophical divide. Aquinas believed in the mind's capacity to grasp objective truth, while Hume remained convinced that human knowledge was limited to the patterns of experience. Neither man was willing to concede ground easily, and both recognized that their disagreement about beauty reflected deeper questions about the nature of knowledge itself. Around them, the pub's evening crowd continued to grow, but the two philosophers remained absorbed in their intellectual duel. The stakes had been raised beyond aesthetic theory into the fundamental question of whether human beings could ever transcend the limitations of their own perspective to grasp truth about the world as it really is. The conversation had drawn several curious academics to nearby tables, their own discussions temporarily abandoned in favor of eavesdropping on the philosophical heavyweight bout unfolding in the corner booth. Hume seemed to relish the attention, while Aquinas remained focused solely on his opponent, as if the entire world had narrowed to this single exchange of ideas. "Let me approach this differently," Hume said, setting down his glass with deliberate precision. "If beauty is truly objective, as you claim, then there must exist some standard by which we can measure it. Tell me, Thomas, what would such a standard look like? How would we apply it to settle disputes about aesthetic value?" Aquinas' eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a teacher presented with an excellent question. "The standard is not something external that we apply mechanically, like a ruler measuring length. Rather, it emerges from the proper relationship between the beautiful object and the intellect that contemplates it. Beauty consists in the harmony, proportion, and clarity that allow an object to be fully grasped and appreciated by the mind." Harmony, proportion, clarity, Hume repeated slowly, as if testing each word for hidden meanings. These sound suspiciously like human concepts, do they not? When you speak of proper relationship between object and intellect, you seem to be describing psychological states, rather than objective features of the world. A group of graduate students at the next table had given up all pretense of conducting their own conversation and were now openly listening. One of them, a young woman with thick-rimmed glasses, leaned forward with undisguised fascination. Aquinas shook his head vigorously. "You misunderstand the relationship between the subjective and objective aspects of beauty. When I speak of harmony and proportion, I refer to mathematical relationships that exist in the object itself, the golden ratio in classical architecture, the symmetries found in natural forms, the logical structure that makes a musical composition coherent." "But why should mathematical relationships necessarily produce aesthetic pleasure?" Hume pressed. "You assume that the mind naturally appreciates order and pattern, but this assumption requires justification. Why should a particular ratio or symmetry be inherently beautiful rather than merely familiar or comforting to human psychology?" The Scottish philosopher gestured toward the Gothic windows visible through the pub's entrance. "Those arches you mentioned earlier, they appeal to you because you have been culturally conditioned to associate such forms with nobility, spirituality, and permanence. A person raised in a completely different architectural tradition might find them oppressive or strange." Aquinas paused, recognizing the strength of Hume's cultural relativism argument. The medieval philosopher had spent his career defending universal truths against various forms of skepticism, but Hume's challenge required a more nuanced response than simple assertion. "Cultural conditioning certainly influences our initial reactions," Aquinas conceded, "but it cannot fully explain the persistence of certain aesthetic judgments across radically different societies. Consider the universal human appreciation for natural beauty, sunsets, mountains, flowers. These preferences cannot be reduced to cultural programming because they appear in cultures that have had no contact with one another." Hume's eyebrows rose with interest. "Natural beauty presents an intriguing case, I admit, but could this universality not result from our shared biological heritage rather than from objective aesthetic properties in nature itself? Humans might be programmed to find certain natural scenes beautiful because our ancestors who appreciated such environments were more likely to survive and reproduce." The debate had reached a crucial juncture. Both philosophers recognized that their disagreement about natural beauty reflected competing theories about the relationship between human nature and objective reality. Was aesthetic appreciation a window into the structure of the world, or merely a mirror reflecting our own evolutionary history? "You reduce everything to biological utility," Aquinas observed, his tone carrying a hint of frustration. "But this explanation undermines itself. If our aesthetic judgments are merely evolutionary programming, why should we trust your argument that beauty is subjective?" Your own reasoning would be nothing more than the result of natural selection, with no claim to truth beyond its survival value. The point landed with considerable force. Hume's empiricism had always struggled with the problem of self-reference. If human knowledge was limited to experience and psychological association, how could philosophical arguments themselves claim any authority beyond personal preference? Hume paused, clearly recognizing the challenge. The pub around them had grown quieter still, as if the assembled academics sensed that something significant was happening at the corner table. The young woman with glasses was taking notes on a napkin, while a bearded professor nearby had abandoned his own drink entirely. "You raise a fair point about the self-referential problem," Hume admitted with characteristic intellectual honesty. "But consider this. Even if my skepticism about objective beauty cannot claim absolute certainty, it remains more consistent with our actual experience of aesthetic disagreement than your confidence in universal standards." The Scottish philosopher leaned back, studying his opponent's reaction. "Your theory requires us to believe that aesthetic disputes result from ignorance or error, while mine simply acknowledges that different people have different tastes. Which explanation better fits the evidence of our daily experience?" The weight of Hume's challenge settled over the table like evening mist. Aquinas stared into his nearly empty pint, watching the foam cling to the sides of the glass in delicate patterns that seemed to echo the very aesthetic questions they were debating. The medieval philosopher's silence stretched long enough for the ambient pub noise to reassert itself, the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation creating a backdrop against which their intellectual struggle continued. "You ask which explanation better fits our daily experience," Aquinas finally said, his voice carrying a new note of personal reflection. "But perhaps we should examine more carefully what actually happens when we encounter something we consider beautiful. Is it truly as simple as you suggest? A mere expression of personal preference?" He gestured toward a young couple at a nearby table who were sharing what appeared to be their first date. The woman had just received a small bouquet of wildflowers from her companion, and her face radiated genuine delight. Watch that woman's reaction to those flowers. Does she simply report a subjective feeling, or does she recognize something in them that calls forth her admiration? Hume followed Aquinas's gaze, studying the scene with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher. "I see someone experiencing pleasure, certainly, but how can you claim to know that her response corresponds to objective beauty rather than personal association, cultural conditioning, or simple romantic excitement?" "Because," Aquinas replied with growing intensity, "her reaction involves judgment, not merely feeling. She does not simply say, 'I like these flowers,' but rather, 'These flowers are beautiful.' The very language we use when confronting beauty implies that we are making claims about the objects themselves, not merely reporting our internal states." The distinction seemed to energize both philosophers. Hume leaned forward, his skeptical instincts fully engaged. "But language can deceive us about the nature of our own experience. When I say this wine is excellent, I use objective-sounding language, but I am really expressing my personal taste. Why should aesthetic judgment be any different?" "Because," Aquinas responded immediately, "when you declare a wine excellent, you are indeed making a claim that transcends mere personal preference. You are saying that the wine possesses qualities that any competent judge would recognize and appreciate. If someone disagrees, you do not simply shrug and say, 'different tastes.' You attempt to educate their palate, to help them perceive what you have perceived." The example had unexpected power, Around them, several conversations had shifted toward questions of taste and judgment, as if the philosophers' debate were creating ripples throughout the pub's intellectual atmosphere. The graduate student with glasses was now scribbling frantically on multiple napkins, while others strained to catch each exchange. Hume considered this carefully, his empirical training demanding that he examine his own experience of making such judgments. "I grant that we often behave as if our aesthetic judgments were objective," he said slowly, "but this might simply reflect a useful fiction. Perhaps we evolved to speak and think as if beauty were objective, because such behavior promotes social cooperation and shared cultural standards." "A useful fiction?" Aquinas's voice carried a note of incredulity. "You would reduce the entire human experience of beauty to an evolutionary mistake. This seems to me a far more unlikely explanation than the simple recognition that beauty reflects genuine features of reality." The medieval philosopher's passionate defense of objective beauty struck several listeners as deeply moving, even heroic. There was something compelling about his refusal to reduce the most profound human experiences to mere survival mechanisms or cultural conventions. Hume sensed the emotional power of his opponent's position, but remained committed to his empirical principles. It is not a mistake, Thomas, but rather an adaptive strategy. The fact that our aesthetic experiences feel meaningful and objective does not prove that they correspond to mind-independent features of reality. Strong subjective experiences often feel as if they reveal objective truth. Consider how certain we feel about our moral convictions or religious insights. But you assume, Aquinas countered, that feeling and reality must be opposed to one another. What if our aesthetic experiences feel objective precisely because they are objective? What if the mind's capacity to recognize beauty reflects its fundamental attunement to the structure of reality itself? The question exposed the deepest philosophical divide between them. Hume's empiricism assumed a fundamental gap between subjective experience and objective reality, while Aquinas believed in the mind's capacity to bridge that gap through proper functioning of the intellect. A middle-aged professor at the bar had turned completely around and was now openly listening, his own conversation forgotten. The young couple with the flowers seemed oblivious to the philosophical storm surrounding them, but their continued delight in the simple bouquet provided a living illustration of the very phenomenon under debate. Consider this, Aquinas continued, sensing an opportunity to press his advantage. When experts in any field, wine tasting, musical composition, architectural design, reach consensus about excellence, they do not merely report similar preferences. They claim to have discerned objective qualities that justify their judgments. Are all these experts simply deluded about the nature of their own expertise? Hume paused, recognizing the force of the argument, while searching for a response that would preserve his empirical commitments. The stakes of their debate had become clear to everyone present. They were arguing not just about beauty, but about the fundamental question of whether human beings could ever truly know the world beyond their own experience. The mention of expertise had introduced a new dimension to their debate, one that both philosophers seemed to recognize as potentially decisive. Hume's empirical philosophy had always struggled with the problem of expertise. If all knowledge derived from individual experience, how could some judgments claim greater authority than others? Your appeal to expert consensus is intriguing, Hume admitted, swirling the remaining whiskey in his glass. But tell me, Thomas, how do we identify legitimate experts in matters of beauty? And more importantly, why should their judgments carry more weight than those of ordinary people who simply know what they like? The question struck at a vulnerable point in Aquinas' argument. The medieval philosopher had built his intellectual system on the assumption that some minds were naturally better equipped to discern truth than others, but in the egalitarian atmosphere of the modern pub, such claims seemed suspect. Expertise in aesthetic matters, Aquinas replied carefully, is not merely a matter of personal preference or social status. It emerges from sustained attention to the objects of beauty, from training that allows the mind to perceive subtleties that escape casual observation. A master musician can hear harmonic relationships that remain invisible to the untrained ear. Several musicians in the pub had indeed gathered near their table, drawn by the discussion of their craft. One of them, a violinist with calloused fingers, nodded vigorously at Aquinas' words, while her companion, a composer, seemed more skeptical. Hume seized on this division. But notice how even among your supposed experts, we find disagreement. Classical musicians might dismiss jazz as chaotic noise, while jazz musicians find classical music rigid and lifeless. Which group possesses the correct aesthetic judgment? Both, Aquinas responded without hesitation, insofar as each recognizes genuine beauty within their respective traditions. The existence of multiple forms of beauty does not negate the objectivity of beauty itself, any more than the existence of multiple mathematical systems negates the objectivity of mathematical truth. The analogy to mathematics had appeared repeatedly in their conversation, and Hume was growing tired of it. But mathematical systems, unlike aesthetic traditions, can be evaluated for internal consistency and practical utility. How do we evaluate competing claims about beauty without simply imposing our own preferences? The composer, who had been listening, spoke up unexpectedly. "If I may interrupt," she said with a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins, "I think both of you are missing something important. When I compose, I do not simply express personal preferences or follow cultural conventions. I work with materials, sounds, rhythms, harmonies that have their own inherent possibilities and limitations." Both philosophers turned toward her with interest. The intervention of a practicing artist, had the potential to shift their debate from abstract theory toward concrete experience. "Please continue," Aquinas encouraged, sensing a potential ally. "The materials of music," she explained, "are not infinitely malleable. Certain combinations of notes create tension that demands resolution. Certain rhythms establish expectations that can be fulfilled or deliberately frustrated. These are not matters of personal opinion, but features of how sound itself behaves." Hume studied the composer with his characteristic skeptical gaze. "But why should the behavior of sound waves determine aesthetic value? You describe psychological expectations and physical properties, not objective beauty." "Because," the composer replied with growing confidence, "beauty emerges from the intelligent use of these materials. A composer who ignores the natural tendencies of musical elements will create works that feel arbitrary or incoherent. One who works with these tendencies can create structures of genuine beauty." Aquinas felt a surge of vindication. "Precisely. Beauty is not imposed upon matter by subjective preference, but discovered through careful attention to the inherent possibilities of the materials themselves." But Hume remained unconvinced. "This still assumes that our psychological responses to tension and resolution reflect objective features of reality rather than contingent facts about human cognition. Why should the structure of sound waves necessarily correspond to aesthetic value?" The debate had reached another crucial juncture. The composer's intervention had grounded their abstract discussion in the concrete experience of artistic creation, but the fundamental philosophical divide remained. Were the patterns that artists discovered in their materials evidence of objective beauty, or simply projections of human psychology onto neutral physical phenomena? Around them, the pub had become an impromptu philosophical salon. Graduate students, professors, and working artists had abandoned their own conversations to focus on the extraordinary debate unfolding in their midst. The young woman with glasses had recruited several friends to help her transcribe the discussion, while the bearded professor had begun organizing an informal betting pool on the outcome. "Let me pose a different question," Aquinas said, addressing both Hume and the assembled crowd. "If beauty is truly subjective, why do we care so passionately about aesthetic education? Why do we build museums, conservatories, and universities dedicated to training people to appreciate art, music, and literature?" The question hung in the air like incense, weighted with implications that extended far beyond aesthetic theory into the very foundations of cultural life. If Hume was correct about the subjectivity of beauty, then vast sectors of human civilization were built upon illusion. The atmosphere in Sullivan's pub had transformed completely. What had begun as a casual conversation between two academics had evolved into something approaching a public intellectual event. Tables had been quietly rearranged to form a rough semicircle around the corner booth, and the usual Friday evening crowd had been supplemented by word-of-mouth arrivals from the university district. Aquinas seemed to sense the weight of expectations surrounding their debate. His question about aesthetic education had struck a nerve among the assembled academics and artists, many of whom had devoted their careers to the assumption that some aesthetic judgments were more valuable than others. "Your question cuts to the heart of our cultural institutions," Hume acknowledged, his tone carrying a note of respect for the challenge. "But consider an alternative explanation. Perhaps we invest in aesthetic education not because beauty is objective, but because shared standards of taste serve important social functions. Museums and conservatories might exist to create cultural cohesion rather than to reveal objective truth." A young art history professor who had been listening intently spoke up from the crowd. "But that seems to reduce everything to politics and social control. When I teach students to see the revolutionary innovations in Impressionist painting, am I really just imposing arbitrary cultural standards?" Hume turned toward her with genuine interest. "Not arbitrary, certainly, but consider how your teaching methods rely on historical narrative, cultural context, and biographical details about the artists. You are not simply pointing to objective features of the paintings themselves, but rather embedding them within human stories that make them meaningful to contemporary viewers." The professor looked troubled by this observation, and several of her colleagues murmured agreement with her concern. The practical implications of Hume's skepticism were becoming clear. If aesthetic judgment was purely subjective, then the entire enterprise of cultural education might be nothing more than sophisticated propaganda. Aquinas sensed the opening and pressed his advantage. "David, your position leads to a kind of cultural nihilism, that contradicts our deepest experience of education and discovery. When a student suddenly grasps the beauty of a Bach fugue or a Euclidean proof, something real happens, not mere conditioning or social conformity, but genuine recognition of objective value. Bach fugues and Euclidean proofs, Hume replied with a slight smile, are very different things. So mathematical proofs can be verified through logical demonstration, but musical appreciation remains stubbornly dependent on personal and cultural factors. The composer who had spoken earlier raised her hand tentatively. But what about the mathematical structures within Bach's music? The fugue form itself follows principles that can be analyzed objectively: the relationship between subject and counter-subject, the rules of harmonic progression, the proportional relationships between sections. Hume nodded approvingly. I grant that music contains mathematical elements that can be analyzed objectively. But why should mathematical structure necessarily produce aesthetic value? The fact that Bach's fugues follow certain formal patterns does not prove that our appreciation of them reflects objective beauty rather than culturally learned responses. An elderly professor of musicology, distinguished by his thick white beard and worn tweed jacket, had been listening with growing agitation. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "Young man," he addressed Hume with the authority of decades in the classroom, "your skepticism may be intellectually consistent, but it is existentially devastating. If you are correct, then my life's work studying the evolution of musical form has been an elaborate delusion." The personal stakes of their philosophical debate had suddenly become visible to everyone present. Hume's empiricism, however rigorous, threatened to undermine the foundations upon which many of the listeners had built their careers and identities. Hume seemed genuinely moved by the professor's distress. "I do not mean to diminish the value of your scholarship," he said gently. "Even if aesthetic judgment is subjective, the study of how different cultures and periods have constructed their standards of beauty remains fascinating and important. We can appreciate the human creativity involved in developing artistic traditions without claiming that these traditions reveal objective truth." But Aquinas shook his head vigorously. "You offer cold comfort, David. If beauty is merely subjective, then human beings are fundamentally isolated from one another in their deepest experiences. We can share information about cultural conventions, but we can never truly share the experience of beauty itself." The observation carried unexpected emotional weight. Around the room, couples and friends looked at each other with new awareness of the philosophical chasm that Hume's position opened between individual consciousness. If aesthetic experience was purely personal, then the moments of shared appreciation that seemed to connect human beings most deeply were really illusions. A young couple near the window, not the pair with the flowers but another who had been quietly sharing a dessert, looked particularly stricken by this implication. Their evening of romantic connection had suddenly been cast in a different light by the philosophical debate surrounding them. "But perhaps," Hume continued, "that isolation is simply the human condition. We are each trapped within our own experience, whether we acknowledge it or not. The belief in objective beauty might be a comforting fiction that helps us feel less alone, but it does not change the fundamental privacy of consciousness." The stark honesty of Hume's position commanded respect even from those who found it deeply unsettling. Here was a philosopher willing to follow his premises to their logical conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. Aquinas stared across the table at his opponent with something approaching admiration. "Your consistency is remarkable, David, but I cannot accept that human beings are so radically isolated from truth and from each other. The very fact that we are having this conversation, that minds separated by centuries can engage with the same ideas, suggests that reason provides genuine access to objective reality." The debate had reached its climax, and everyone in Sullivan's pub seemed to sense it. The normal sounds of evening revelry had given way to an almost cathedral-like silence, broken only by the occasional clink of glass or whispered comment. The two philosophers sat across from each other like ancient combatants, each having deployed their finest weapons, neither yet claiming decisive victory. Aquinas' appeal to the very possibility of rational discourse had struck at the foundations of Hume's empiricism. If knowledge was truly limited to individual experience, how could philosophical argument itself have any validity? Yet Hume had spent his career developing sophisticated arguments for skepticism, apparently believing that reason could demonstrate the limits of reason. "You raise the deepest question of all," Hume acknowledged, his voice carrying a note of philosophical exhaustion. "The problem of rational discourse itself. I confess that my position leads to difficulties that I have never fully resolved. If knowledge is limited to experience, then perhaps even our debate is merely an elaborate dance of subjective associations rather than a genuine search for truth. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd. Hume's intellectual honesty had led him to acknowledge the self-referential problems in his own position, but he seemed reluctant to abandon his empirical commitments despite their philosophical costs. Aquinas leaned forward, sensing that this moment of vulnerability might offer an opportunity for synthesis rather than victory. Perhaps, David, we have been approaching this question too abstractly. Let us return to the concrete experience of beauty and ask ourselves what actually happens when two people share aesthetic appreciation. He gestured toward the elderly musicology professor, who had been following their exchange with intense concentration. Professor, would you be willing to help us with an experiment? The white-bearded scholar nodded eagerly, clearly pleased to contribute to the discussion that had so directly challenged his life's work. Hum a few bars of a melody that you find particularly beautiful, Aquinas requested. The professor thought for a moment, then began to hum the opening theme from Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, his voice wavering slightly with age, but maintaining the essential shape and character of the melody. As the familiar tune filled the pub, something remarkable happened. Conversations throughout the room ceased entirely, and a palpable sense of shared appreciation settled over the crowd. When the professor finished, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before scattered applause broke out spontaneously. Several people were smiling with evident pleasure, while others seemed lost in reverie prompted by musical memory. Now, Aquinas said to Hume, explain to me how what just occurred can be reduced to mere subjective association or cultural conditioning. Did we not all participate in something together? Did the melody not call forth a response that transcended individual preference? Hume studied the faces around the room, clearly moved by what he had witnessed, but reluctant to abandon his philosophical principles. I grant that we seem to share a common response, he said slowly, but this might simply reflect our common cultural background and shared human nature. The melody affected us similarly because we have similar nervous systems and cultural training. But why, Aquinas pressed, should similar nervous systems and cultural training necessarily produce appreciation for this particular melody rather than some other? You still have not explained why beauty appears where it does rather than somewhere else. The question exposed a persistent weakness in Hume's position. While his empiricism could explain why humans might share certain tendencies, it struggled to account for the specific patterns of aesthetic preference that actually emerged in human culture. A young philosophy student who had been taking notes throughout the evening raised her hand tentatively. Professor Hume, if I may ask, do you yourself experience beauty when you hear music or see art? And if so, how do you understand that experience in light of your philosophical position? The personal question caught Hume off guard. Throughout the evening, he had maintained the stance of a detached analyst, but now he was being asked to examine his own aesthetic experience through the lens of his skeptical philosophy. I confess, Hume said after a long pause, that I do experience what I would describe as aesthetic pleasure, and that this experience feels as objective and significant as Thomas claims. When I hear a particularly beautiful piece of music or see a striking sunset, I am moved in ways that seem to transcend mere personal preference. The admission created a profound moment of tension. Hume's philosophical integrity was warring with his lived experience, and the conflict was visible to everyone present. Aquinas spoke gently, recognizing his opponent's vulnerability. Perhaps your own experience provides the best evidence against your theoretical position. When you encounter genuine beauty, you do not simply report a subjective feeling. You recognize something that calls forth admiration and wonder. Hume looked around the room at the faces watching him expectantly. The weight of philosophical consistency pressed against the undeniable reality of his own aesthetic experience. After a lifetime of skeptical inquiry, he found himself confronting the possibility that some truths might be too fundamental to doubt, even if they could not be proven through empirical analysis. Perhaps, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, there are aspects of human experience that resist reduction to simple categories of subjective and objective. Perhaps the experience of beauty occupies a middle ground that neither purely empirical nor purely rational analysis can fully capture. The concession was modest, but in the context of their debate, it represented a significant shift. Hume was acknowledging that his empirical framework might be inadequate to explain the full range of human experience, including the phenomenon they had spent the evening discussing. Aquinas nodded slowly, recognizing that he had not achieved complete victory, but had perhaps accomplished something more valuable, a moment of genuine philosophical dialogue in which both participants had been changed by the encounter. The crowd in Sullivan's pub began to disperse gradually, conversations resuming in small groups as people processed what they had witnessed. As the evening wound down, the two philosophers sat in companionable silence, each contemplating the ideas they had exchanged and the questions that remained unresolved. Outside, the rain had stopped, and stars were becoming visible through the breaking clouds, a sight that both men, despite their philosophical differences, found undeniably beautiful.